Hey Forge members, Anthony here, and welcome to day 2 of our React tutorial series. In this tutorial, we're pretty much just going to put together a very basic React app. I'm going to show you how to install React, make sure that you have a program running, and then we're going to make a simple counter application. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to use this tool created by Facebook called Create React App. Now normally when you are creating a React web application, if you were to do it all from scratch, there is a lot of different things that you have to set up. Things like Babel and Webpack, which both do various different things. However, if you're someone that's just getting started and you want to get your hands dirty, I highly recommend using Create React App, which isn't like any cheating or anything. People also use this for production level applications. So you shouldn't feel like you're missing out on anything if you're using Create React App. So the first thing we got to do is open up our terminal here, and what we are going to do is make sure that npm and node is installed first. So if you just type npm-version, you should see that, and if you type node-version, you see that. If you don't have Node or npm installed on your machine, you can just Google it. They're very common tools, so it should be very easy to install. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is go into our directory that we want to make this project in. So I'm going to make a directory called code, and I'm going to go inside of this code directory. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that Create React App is installed globally on my machine. So you only have to ever do this once. So what you do is you type npm -g create-react-app. Now what this does is you're saying I is short for install. This -g modifier is just saying that you want to install this package globally. npm is a package manager, and the package we are installing is the Create React App. So altogether we are telling npm to install Create React App globally, which means no matter what directory we are in, we'll be able to access this library to create a React app. So I already have Create React App installed, so that's why I get this message. But if you don't, it might take around a minute. So now what we're going to do is we're going to type Create React App, and then we are going to type the name of the application we're creating. So let's just say something like counter. So what it'll do is it'll take around a minute to install to set pretty much your development environment up, install all the necessary dependencies that React uses, and this might take around a minute. Alright, so it looks like we're done installing and creating our React app. So now if we type ls, we can see that we have a counter file, and if we go inside the counter file, we can see we have a couple of different files. So we're going to analyze that in just a second. Now, you're welcome to use any code editor you're comfortable with. I highly recommend using Visual Studio. I never used it before I started doing anything related to React, but I am a big fan of it. It's lightweight, but it also has everything you would want in an IDE. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to open our file. So I'm going to navigate to that. I'm going to go to desktop. Let's go to code, and let's open the counter file. And let's take a look at what we have inside here. So immediately you'll see that we have 3 different directories. We have a git ignore file, a package.json, a readme, and a yarn file. So I'm just going to go through all of these simply. If you already know a bit about how Node works, then this probably won't be too surprising for you. But if not, this is what all this means. So Node modules is pretty much where all your libraries and all your dependencies are. So as you can see, there's a ton of different things in here. We're not going to go into any of them. It's just where it stores all the libraries that you've installed. Now public is where you are going to find things that will be accessible to users on their browser when they look at your web app. So this includes the single HTML page that will load in your React app, things like your favicon and a manifest. Now, if we get into source, this is where you'll be spending most of your time, and this is where your React app already lives. So we're just going to take a brief look at some of the files here. So your app.js is pretty much the main application that you will be, the main component that you will be putting all your other components inside of. The app.test.js is pretty much just a unit test file. for the app test, you can go ahead and delete that. We won't need that for this tutorial. Your index.js is the actual major high-level component that gets rendered into the HTML file. So I'm not going to go too deep into this, just because we want to get started as fast as possible. But you'll see here that pretty much we are rendering the app component into our HTML element that has the ID called root. And if we actually go back to our HTML file, we'll see here in the body we have a div which has an ID of root. And this index file is sort of the bridge between our main app component and our HTML file. It pretty much says, I want to insert the app component into the HTML element that has an ID of root. So you don't need to change any of that there. So let's take a look at our app.js. So we can see here that it sort of looks like we have what looks like HTML inside of here, but we also have some weird JavaScript or Java looking code as well. So the way React works is you actually render in specific HTML, and this HTML is known as JSX. So it looks a lot like HTML, except you can put JavaScript code inside of it. So you'll notice there are a couple main differences. So for example, we have an image tag here, and within that image tag, we have set the source to this variable called logo. In JSX, you can actually set variable names. So in this case, our logo is actually this logo file that we import, and we are setting the source equal to it. It's important to note whenever we want to call a variable from our JSX, all we have to do is put it in these two braces, and we'll be getting into a lot of that later. But let's run our React app and see what we have going on. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to start a new terminal where we are, and if you were to look at the package.json, the package.json pretty much keeps track of all the dependencies you have installed and their relative versions. So as we can see here, the create React app automatically installed React, React DOM, and React scripts. Now, we see here that we also have a couple of different scripts here. And what that means is if I were to type npm start, it would run this command. And this command is our default command for starting our React project. So I'm going to go ahead and type npm start. And it'll take a little while, but what you'll see happening is in our terminal, it'll actually start our development environment, and it'll automatically open up a browser, and this might take, maybe 20 seconds. It'll automatically start up a browser with the default React app that comes installed, which you'll see in just a second here, once this loads. And here we go. So this is our initial React app that was installed. It's very simple, but we can see here if I were to move this to the right and then bring this over to the left, if I were to actually go in to this app.js, if I were to edit anything here and save it, it would automatically re-render on this HTML page. So for example, if we look over here, it says edit, source, app.js, and save to reload. Let's change this text to maybe say, hello, I am in app.js. Now as soon as we save it, you'll see that it automatically reloads and changes what is inside of that specific container. So now let's go ahead and delete some of the stuff. Oops, not sure what happened there. Cool. So let's go ahead and delete all of this stuff so that we just have a pretty blank slate to work with. And I'm just going to create, maybe a header that says like, this is the blank slate we're working with. And this is just standard HTML. So here we go. A good thing to note is within these render tags, so within this opening and closing bracket, you can only have one high level element. So what that means is everything inside of this return has to be within this initial div tag. If I were to try and create another div and put, let's say, like another header like an h2 and says like this is my h2, we'll see here that it doesn't actually let us compile this. This is because you can only have one root tag for every render file. So everything has to be within these tags over here. I could create another div and then put an h2 tag here. This is our h2. And if I were to save it, you'll see here that it'll display it. So it's very similar to HTML. So let's go ahead and create a counter. So let's get rid of this, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a new component. So what we're going to do is we're going to come to our source, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it counter.js. Now, when we set up a new React component, we can actually analyze our previous React component to see the things we need. The first thing we need to do is import React and the component library from our React library itself. So once we have done that, what we're going to do is we are going to create the actual component class itself. Now, you should note that there are two ways to do this. One of them is called functionally, and one of them is class-oriented. When you are making applications that is more lightweight and maybe not that complex, you can get away with doing things functionally. But for most high-level applications and big applications and more complex applications, you're going to be using the class structure, which means you're going to create a class. Your component will be a class that has the name counter, and within it, it will have all of the code that we need to use. And the last major thing we have to note is what we have to do at the end of the file is simply export the component. So what we have done here is we've pretty much just declared the class, which has the name of our component. We've extended the component class, which is just necessary syntax. And then at the end, what we're doing is we're exporting our class. And what that allows us to do is I can now come into our app.js file and I can actually import the counter component. So if I were to save this file, so now I can import counter from /counter. Now, you're going to see that we have a couple of different warnings here. The first warning, so depending on how you set up your environment, we'll see here in my app.js, number one, I have imported counter, but I haven't actually used it anywhere. So, and the second thing is I have this logo file, but I haven't used it anywhere either. If you remember, we deleted all the previous code that was there, and one of them used the logo. So we can go ahead and delete that. And we're going to get to this second, error in just a second. So in our counter, we're going to just set up the basic component. So we're going to do it exactly as you see here. We can even copy this code and paste it in here. Instead of having our div have a class name, we can just leave that to default, and what we can do is set this to some paragraph tags, and we can say this is our counter. Now what's going to happen here is we're not going to see any difference on our web app just yet. So what we have to do is actually use that counter within our app. So we're gonna put that counter component inside of our app component, and the way you do that is just by using HTML tags with the name of our component. So you can see here, since I have imported the counter component, all I have to do is to create HTML tags that has that counter name inside of it. And a little bit of syntax here. Instead of having this open and close tag, what you can actually do is you can simply just close the tag in the same statement by doing this. You have the open tag, the name of the component, and then an immediate close tag. And this is just some good syntax to know. It's the exact same as having an opening and closing tag. So if we were to save this now, we'll see that we actually see our text that we have in our counter component showing up in the app component itself. And this is what we call a parent-to-child relationship. So our parent component is the app component, and we are inputting another component within that, a child component, and that child component is called our counter. Wherever we put this counter within our app component, it will display all the HTML here that inside of this component. So it's sort of just like rendering all this HTML wherever you see this counter component called. And you can call it multiple times, for example, so we can have like, 5 different counter components, and we'll just have that same HTML showing up 5 different times. So let's go and start to build out some of the functionality of this actual counter app. So one of the core concepts in React is called state. And state is sort of a way to keep track of instance variables within your component. So in our counter component, obviously one of the biggest things we're going to want to keep track of is the count. Our counter component is going to be very simple. We're going to have something that says, this is our current count. Right, so, and we're going to have a number here for current count, and then we're going to have 2 buttons. One of them is going to be to increment the count, and one of them is going to be the decrement the count. And whenever we click the button to increment the count, our count will increment by 1. Whenever we click the decrement button, our count will decrement by 1. So it's pretty simple. Now, we need a way to keep track of what that count is, and the way we do that is using a tool called state, which, like I said, is sort of a way to keep track of instance variables. The way we're going to use this state is first by creating a function called a constructor. Now, within our constructor, we pass in a variable called props. This is a bit more complicated, and I don't want you guys to worry about this now. We're going to get into this in a future video of what all of this means. But essentially, this is something that will run whenever the component is mounted or created. And we are going to just call super and props within it. So now that we've sort of gotten that out of the way, don't worry about exactly what this all means. The next thing we're going to do is actually create our state variable. And our state variable is actually going to be a dictionary. If you think about it, a dictionary is perfect because it works off of key value operations. And the instance variables we're going to have are simply key values. So let's take our count, for example. If we type this.state is equal to a map, and then we can set our counter variable equal to whatever the default value we want our count to be. So let's just set that count to 0 for now. If we were to save this, we'll see that it doesn't really make a difference anywhere on the page, but it still compiles properly. Now, let's say we want to actually display the count over here where we have it. Now, like I said, when you want to display variables inside of React, or this sort of HTML structure, which is JSX, all we have to do is create 2 squiggly brackets and then just type the variable name. In order to access this state variable, all we have to do is type this.state and then the name of the variable we are accessing, which in this case is counter. Or rather, we should rename this to count because it just makes more sense. It's literally the count. So now if we were to save this, we can say here we have this is our current count, 0. If we were to set this to a different number, we would see that it would change here. And this number, like I said, is just our default. So now let's go and make our increment and decrement button. So all I'm going to do is create 2 buttons under here. One button, and I'm going to call this increment, and then the next button I'm going to call it decrement. I hope I'm spelling that right. And when we save, we'll see that we have these 2 buttons here. You'll notice that clicking it actually doesn't do anything. Now, the beautiful part of React is we can sort of, in a modular way, make our buttons change the state of our component based on how we want to. So the way we do that is we create 2 functions, one for increment and one for decrement. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So I'm going to create a function called increment, and we're going to use a sort of arrow function to declare this function. So if you haven't seen anything that sort of looks like this, this is just sort of syntax. This is just basically a function. We're saying that it doesn't take in any parameters. If I save, it'll probably Yeah, it'll probably just, because we have nothing in there right now, it'll move this all to one line. But pretty much we can have what we want to do in that function in here. So what we want to happen when we increment, when we click this increment button, is we want it to increment the count. So what's actually happening when we increment the count is our state variable count is being incremented by 1. So the way we can do that is when we want to edit state in functions that are not our constructor, we use a function called setState. So we can say this dot set state, and now within here we can actually rewrite the variables that are in our current state. So I can say count is now equal to this dot state dot count plus 1. Now this is the equivalent of setting a variable called, let's say like let current count equals to this dot state dot count, and then saying current count is now equal to current count dot 1. It's just sort of a shorter way to do that. So let's change that back. So our count is going to be equal to whatever the current count is added by 1. Now let's do the same thing for decrement. So decrement equals this arrow function, and then this dot set state, and we're going to say count is equal to this dot state dot count minus 1. And let's set our count back to 0 just for simplicity's sake. Now you'll notice things still don't quite work. The last step here is to connect these functions with these buttons. And the way you do that is through JavaScript event listeners. If you've done a lot of work on front-end development before, you'll know what I'm talking about. But for simplicity's sake, what we want to happen is whenever we click this button, whenever we click the increment button, we want the increment function to run. So we can say onClick is equal, and then we have our curly braces, to this dot increment. And what that means is we're saying we want it, whenever we click this button, we want this increment function to run. So now if we save that, we'll see that everything looks the same, but if we were to click the increment button, all of a sudden it works fine, and we can keep on clicking it over and over again. Now if we were to now let's do the same thing for the decrement. We're going to set the onClick equal to squiggly brackets because we're calling a JavaScript function here, this dot decrement. Now I'm going to go ahead and save that, and what we have here is a working counter. Now this is very simple. The whole point of this video was just to illustrate sort of how you nest a component within another component and how states work, and sort of the idea that if I am changing something dynamically, you're noticing we are changing this counter component, nothing else has to reload when we want to do that, which is the beautiful thing about React. Only the thing that changes is being re-rendered. So, and just to illustrate the idea of components again, we could create like 5 different counters here, and you can see all of them sort of perform the exact same function. Now, in our next video, we are going to go over sort of the idea of passing data from a parent component into a child component, and vice versa, a child component into a parent component. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, make sure you subscribe, leave a thumbs up, and if you're someone that's learning React because you're trying to get a job in the industry, because React is quite frankly, one of the most wanted skills that a web developer could have in this day and age, make sure you sign up at theforge.ca. This is a free community that I've started. We have over 1,000 members. We have things like access to interviews with recruiters, current employees at companies like Google, Microsoft, Intuit, Amazon, and we just have a lot of resources for students, especially people that are looking for internships or jobs. So make sure you sign up at theforge.ca. Thanks for watching, guys.